I am Valerie, 31 years old. Black Excellence in Atlanta's Buckhead district is an exclusive club. It's a world of custom-tailored suits, multi-million-dollar real estate deals, and legacy families who pride themselves on pedigree. Tonight, at the St. Regis Hotel's grandest ballroom, my husband Desmond stood at the podium of his family's charity gala. He is the heir to a prominent real estate dynasty, a man whose charm masks an empty, crumbling empire. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Desmond chuckled, tapping his silver fork against his crystal champagne flute. The room of 470 elite guests fell silent, hanging on his every word. My firm is raising capital for our next major development, but if anyone here is willing to spare just $10, I will gladly throw in this useless wife of mine. She can't read a P&L statement to save her life, but I assure you, she waters the houseplants beautifully. A roar of laughter erupted from the VIP tables. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. At table 1, my sister-in-law Kendra lazily stirred her martini. She made sure her voice carried. $10 is overpaying, Desmond. She's been leeching off this family for 6 years. Even the diamond on her finger was bought with our legacy money. Her husband Trey, a man whose arrogance was inflated entirely by his Ivy League MBA, chimed in. Buy her for $10. She's only good for braiding hair and sweeping floors. It's an embarrassment to the Black excellence this family built. I sat perfectly still. I didn't shed a tear. I simply smoothed the edge of my black silk gown. What these people didn't know was that the useless leeching wife they were currently humiliating was the anonymous venture capitalist who had pumped tens of millions of dollars into Desmond's failing company just to keep it out of bankruptcy for the last 2 years. $10 million. The deep, icy voice sliced through the sea of laughter. The entire ballroom gasped, 470 heads turning simultaneously toward the grand mahogany doors. Sterling strode in. He was the most feared, ruthless private equity titan on the East Coast, the exact man Desmond had spent the last month begging for a 5-minute meeting. Dressed in a flawless black tuxedo, his gaze cut straight to the podium. Desmond's mocking smile froze. He swallowed hard, his confidence suddenly evaporating. Mr. Sterling, you have a great sense of humor. Having you at my fundraising gala is an honor, but you really don't need to participate in the joke. Who said I was joking? Sterling didn't even look at Desmond. He walked past the silent rows of tables and stopped directly in front of me. To the absolute shock of everyone in the room, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a signed check, and placed it neatly on my table. $10 million. Not to buy her, Sterling said, finally casting a dismissive side eye at my husband. Desmond, do you really think $10 buys my boss Valerie your quarterly dividends from the Vanguard Fund just cleared? We're up 20% this month. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Kendra dropped her martini glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the room. Boss, what are you talking about? She shrieked, scrambling to her feet. She's a charity case from the foster system. She must be sleeping with you to get that money. Desmond, do you see this? Your wife is a gold-digging tramp. Trey pointed a shaking finger at me. Security, throw these two out. This is our family's charity gala, not a circus for this delusional woman. I took a slow breath, picked up the $10 million check, folded it, and slipped it into my clutch. Family tray. I stood up, my Louboutin heels clicking sharply on the floor. The family you're so proud of defaulted on its loans 8 months ago. Don't think I don't know that you and Kendra secretly drained $3 million from the corporate reserve to pay off your underground gambling debts in Macau. Trey's face drained of color. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Before he could respond, Sasha burst out from the VIP wings. Desmond had been parading her around all month under the guise of a strategic consultant. She wore a plunging emerald gown, instantly clinging to Desmond's arm. Valerie, have you lost your mind? Desmond is about to sign a $50 million partnership with my father's investment fund. You think anyone believes your fake check? Get out before I have you arrested. Oh, Sasha, I was hoping you'd speak up. I pulled out my phone and tapped a single button. The massive LED screens behind the stage, which had been displaying Desmond's charity logo, instantly switched. They now displayed a series of red-stamped federal court documents. "Your father's investment fund," I gestured to the screen. "You mean the fraudulent real estate mogul who filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at exactly 9 a.m. this morning? His accounts have exactly $412 left." A collective gasp swept through the room. Sasha threw a hand to her chest, her face turning ghost white. "And that Cartier necklace you're wearing," I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, "it's rented from Lux Lend. You're 3 days overdue on the return. And the $50 million you promised Desmond. The truth is you just used his company's assets to secure a fraudulent bank loan." "Turn the screens off," Desmond screamed into the microphone, pure panic gripping him. "Tech team, turn it off now." "Nobody touches those screens," I commanded. "Desmond, you auctioned me off for $10 because you thought you held all the cards. You thought your new mega Buckhead commercial project would save this rotting company, but you forgot one crucial detail: who owns the land?" Desmond's legs began to shake. "What are you talking about?" "Apex Holdings." I smiled coldly. "My shell company. You missed 3 ground lease payments to fund your mistress's lifestyle. I am officially terminating the lease. By midnight, your billion-dollar project legally defaults to me. Your company is worth 0. "You can't do this," Kendra screamed, her voice cracking. "We are the Vanguard family. We are Atlanta royalty." "You were," Sterling corrected her, stepping forward. He gestured to the front tables where Desmond's board of directors and top investors sat, their faces pale with shock. "But right now, you are criminals." Sterling began passing out red folders to the investors. "Valerie didn't just find out about your gambling tray. She audited the charity fund you're raising money for tonight. You haven't donated a dime to youth programs in 3 years. You've been using this gala to launder money." The investors opened the folders, their expressions turning to fury as they saw the wire transfer receipts. Kendra collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The elite socialites she had spent years trying to impress physically backed away from her in disgust. Suddenly, Corinne, my mother-in-law, clutched her chest. She gasped dramatically and slumped against the edge of her table. "My heart, help me," she wailed. "Valerie, how could you? I took you in when you were a nobody. I loved you like a daughter. Someone call an ambulance." I walked over to the nearest table, picked up a pitcher of ice water, and splashed it directly into Corinne's face. She gasped, sitting bolt upright, instantly cured of her heart attack. "You never loved me, Corinne," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You took me in because you were my late father's accountant. When he died, you forged his signature and stole my $2 million life insurance payout to fund Desmond's tuition at Wharton. You kept me close to make sure I never looked into the accounts." The screen behind me shifted again, displaying the forensic handwriting analysis and the hidden bank transfers. The room erupted. The pristine, church-going matriarch of the family had been exposed as a thief. Desmond, seeing his entire world burning down, lost whatever sanity he had left. "I'll kill you!" he roared. He grabbed a heavy crystal champagne bottle from the table and charged at me. I didn't even flinch. Sterling moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted Desmond, twisting his arm sharply behind his back and slamming him face first into the polished marble floor. Desmond groaned in pain, blood pooling from a busted lip. He lay pinned to the ground in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, humiliated, while hundreds of Atlanta's most powerful elites recorded him on their smartphones. "Let him go, Sterling," I said quietly. As Sterling stepped back, the heavy ballroom doors burst open. Sirens wailed outside, the red and blue lights flashing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dozens of armed FBI and IRS agents stormed the room. "Desmond, Trey, and Corinne," the lead agent announced, flashing a warrant. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." Desmond hyperventilated as the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "Valerie, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "We're married. We took vows. I still love you. We can fix this." I walked over to him, reaching into my clutch. I pulled out a single folded document. Our divorce papers already signed by a judge through an expedited private arbitration. I slipped the papers into the breast pocket of his tuxedo. You asked the room who wanted a useless wife for $10. I whispered loud enough for the microphone to catch. But the price for my freedom was a 15-year federal sentence. Enjoy your new home, Desmond. Sasha tried to slip out the back, but 2 officers blocked her path. Identity theft and credit fraud, one of them said, handcuffing her. I smoothed my dress, took Sterling's arm, and walked through the parted crowd of awestruck elites. I stepped into the cool Atlanta night air and slid into the back of my waiting Maybach. 6 months later, the mighty family was gone. Desmond and Trey were wearing orange jumpsuits in federal prison. Corinne was working a minimum wage shift at a diner. Camille was living in a cramped, roach-infested apartment stripped of all her luxury. I stood in the penthouse suite of my newly constructed skyscraper in Buckhead, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. Sterling handed me the finalized deed to the family's former estate. I was bulldozing it to build a shelter for foster youth. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They thought because I came from nothing, I was worth nothing. But the most dangerous woman in the room isn't the one screaming for attention. It's the one quietly buying the building you're standing in. The silence in the St. Regis ballroom was absolutely deafening. 470 of Atlanta's most powerful elites froze. The clinking of silverware ceased, leaving only soft jazz playing. Every single eye darted between the $10 million check, the imposing figure of Sterling standing right beside my table, and the ashen face of my husband Desmond up ahead. Desmond gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so tightly his knuckles turned white, opening his mouth without any sound. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by pure panic. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble into dust, and he was completely right. At table 1, my sister-in-law Kendra stared blankly. The smug satisfaction she had displayed while calling me a foster system charity case evaporated into thin air right away. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to process how the useless woman she had mocked for 6 years was suddenly being handed an 8-figure dividend by the most ruthless private equity titan on the entire East Coast of America. Beside her, Trey looked equally horrified as his ego shattered. His Ivy League superiority complex broke in real time as he realized the magnitude of the wealth sitting before him. Before the shock could fully settle over the stunned crowd, the heavy velvet curtains near the VIP wings were pushed aside. Sasha stormed out, violently acting as Desmond's secret mistress and his supposed financial savior for the past month in Atlanta. Desmond had been parading Sasha around high society all month, introducing her as a brilliant tech heiress from Silicon Valley, whose billionaire father was going to bail out his entire empire. Tonight she wore a plunging emerald designer gown. Her dress swept the floor and her neck dripped with flawless diamonds. Sasha marched directly up the stage steps, her heels clicking. She linked her arm tightly through Desmond's, glaring down menacingly at me like I was an insect in her world. She grabbed the spare microphone from the tall metal stand, her hand trembling with rage and desperate need for attention. Her voice was shrill as it echoed across the ballroom. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Sterling and laughed a high-pitched artificial sound that grated against the ears. She told the room that Sterling was nothing. She claimed he was a paid actor I had hired. She screamed that the check was a pathetic fake illusion, a desperate trick created by a jealous housewife who could not accept that her long marriage was finally completely over. She called me a pathetic nobody who had manipulated my way into a legacy family, declaring that I was completely out of my depth in a room full of wealth. Sasha squeezed Desmond's arm tighter and proudly announced to the entire ballroom that her father, a legendary venture capitalist investor, was officially pledging $50 million to Desmond's real estate. She bragged that her family was bringing real generational wealth to the table, unlike the cheap parlor tricks I pulled. She listed the supposed tech companies her father owned outright, boasting about their summer homes in the Hamptons and jets. She wanted everyone to know that she was the elite, the woman who was going to save Desmond and elevate his family to new heights of power and immense prestige. Desmond seemed to regain a fraction of his shattered confidence with Sasha standing fiercely by his side on the stage. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me boldly. He looked with absolute contempt, fully believing that his rich mistress had just saved him from facing public humiliation in front of peers. He leaned into the microphone and told the security guards to escort me and my hired actor out of the building before he pressed charges for trespassing on private property. I did not yell or raise my voice at all. I did not throw my drink or cause a scene. I did not let a single emotion break my facade. I simply set my water glass down on the tablecloth. I stood up slowly and completely calmly. The entire ballroom held its breath as I stood there. I raised my left wrist and tapped my smartwatch twice. Instantly, the massive LED screens behind the stage went black. The giant golden logos of Desmond's charity vanished from sight. A second later, the screens flashed back to bright life, but they were no longer displaying the fundraising thermometer goals. Instead, they projected high-resolution, unredacted federal court document scans. The text was massive, undeniable, and stamped with official seals. It was the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court. I picked up a microphone from my round table quickly. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of mercy. "Your father's $50 million, I asked, letting the question hang heavily in the tense, suffocating air of the ballroom. "You mean the man who filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at exactly 9 in the morning in federal court downtown?" I pointed to the glowing screen behind their frozen bodies. I told Sasha and the captivated audience to look closely at the projected bank statements displaying her father's real assets. His corporate accounts have exactly $412. He is not a billionaire tech mogul or wealthy investor. He is a broke, desperate con artist, and you are his pathetic accomplice trying to swindle a failing real estate. Sasha let go of Desmond's arm as if burned badly. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing completely soundlessly. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by sheer terror. But I was not finished dismantling her carefully constructed lies. I walked closer to the stage, my eyes locked on the glittering stones sitting heavily around her pale, shaking neck. "And that Cartier diamond piece you are wearing so proudly," I continued, my voice echoing off the hanging crystal chandeliers. "Now, it is rented from Lux Lend, a company I know well. It is 3 days overdue, and they want it back." Sasha turned ghost white as the blood drained from her. Her hands instinctively flew to her neck, trying to hide the rented jewelry from the hundreds of judging eyes staring. A collective gasp swept through the massive crowded hotel ballroom. The elite crowd, the same people who had been laughing at me just minutes ago, began whispering furiously among themselves. Guests were zooming in on the screen, snapping quick photos of the bankruptcy filings and texting the scandalous news widely. The room buzzed with the electric thrill of a scandal. Desmond turned to look at Sasha, his face twisting horribly. He had staked his entire company, his failing marriage and his family reputation on the promise of her father's money. He had alienated his wife, mocked me in public view, and strutted around Atlanta like a king based on lies. Now the realization that he had been conned by a broke social climber was hitting him with massive crushing force. He grabbed Sasha by the shoulders and demanded to know if what I was saying about her family was true. Sasha could not meet his eyes or speak a word. She looked down at the floor, tears of humiliation welling. The deafening silence was her ultimate, undeniable confession of guilt. Desmond shoved her away, stumbling backward as if utterly destroyed. At table 1, Kendra and Trey sat frozen in seats. The smug satisfaction they had displayed just moments ago vanished. Kendra looked sick to her stomach, realizing that the wealthy savior she had been bragging about was a cheap fraud. They had bet on the wrong horse, and now they were trapped in the wreckage of Desmond's spectacular public failure. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, transforming into mockery. The high society elite of Buckhead are notoriously brutally unforgiving when it comes to fake wealth and exposed social climbers. I watched as prominent investors, politicians, and socialites who had been eager to shake Sasha's hand now looked with disgust. Sasha tried to hide her face, sobbing uncontrollably, as people she had tried to impress now treated her like disease. She looked around for an escape route, but the sheer density of the crowd blocked her path to the doors. Sterling stood silently by my side, an intimidating, powerful pillar. His presence alone validated everything I was saying to them. He watched Desmond's pathetic unraveling with cold, clinical detachment now. Sterling then turned to the crowd and spoke, his voice effortlessly, commanding attention without him even needing a microphone today. He confirmed to the room that my holding company had been investigating Sasha's father for several months prior to tonight. He explained that her family had been running a scheme targeting desperate, failing businesses like Desmond's to extract remaining equity. They used fake financial portfolios and rented luxury items constantly to create the illusion of immense wealth and power always. The sheer overwhelming panic in the St. Regis ballroom was absolutely suffocating. Sasha, the supposed tech heiress, pushed her way desperately toward the massive oak exit doors. She tripped over the hem of her rented emerald green designer gown, crying uncontrollably as the high society elite actively stepped away from her, treating her like an infection. Desmond, my soon-to-be ex-husband, stood frozen at the mahogany podium, his mouth hanging open as he stared blankly at the federal bankruptcy documents projected on the massive LED screens behind him. His golden boy image, the foundation of his entire arrogant existence, had just been completely, utterly annihilated. He had humiliated me in front of 470 powerful guests to secure a $50 million bailout from a man whose corporate bank accounts held exactly $412. And now the entire city of Atlanta knew it. At table 1, the initial shock had quickly curdled into violent, defensive rage. Trey, my brother-in-law, the man who had just minutes ago suggested I was only good for braiding hair and sweeping floors, leaped from his seat. His face was flushed purple with fury. He was a man who relied entirely on his Ivy League business degree and his family's legacy to mask his own deep incompetence. Seeing his family's reputation being systematically dismantled on a public stage was more than his fragile ego could bear. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his voice booming over the soft jazz music that was still inexplicably playing from the hotel speakers. Security Trey bellowed, waving his arms frantically toward the perimeter of the room. "Get security in here right now. I want this woman and this hired actor thrown out immediately. This is a private Black elite charity gala, and they are trespassing on our property." Kendra, his wife, and my sister-in-law immediately joined the chorus. She stood up, her expensive silk dress rustling as she glared at me with absolute, unfiltered hatred. She had spent the last 6 years making sure I knew I was an outsider, a foster system charity case who had somehow managed to infiltrate her pristine, wealthy family. She could not accept that the woman she had relentlessly bullied was now commanding the attention of the entire room. "You are a delusional, jealous snake," Valerie Kendra screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She turned to the surrounding tables, desperate to maintain control of the narrative. "Do not listen to a word this psychotic woman says. She is just a bitter housewife trying to ruin my brother's fundraising event because he is finally leaving her. Manager, get in here and remove her." Within seconds, the St. Regis event manager, a tall man named Richard in a sharp navy suit, hurried over. He was flanked by 4 broad-shouldered security guards dressed in crisp black uniforms. They moved quickly, surrounding my table with intimidating precision. The guests sitting nearby leaned away, their eyes wide with morbid fascination, eagerly waiting to see the final humiliating removal of the disgraced wife. Desmond finally seemed to snap out of his paralyzed state. He leaned heavily into the microphone at the podium. "Escort her out of the building." Richard Desmond ordered, his voice trembling, but attempting to sound authoritative. "And make sure she is permanently banned from this property. I will be pressing formal charges for disruption and criminal trespassing first thing tomorrow morning." The security guard stepped forward, reaching out to grab my arms and physically force me out of my chair. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or plead my case. I simply reached into my black designer clutch. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. I pulled out a sleek titanium black American Express Centurion card and a thick stack of freshly notarized legal acquisition papers. The documents were stamped with official red corporate seals. I held them up, keeping my gaze locked entirely on the event manager. Richard stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting from the heavy metal card to the official seals on the legal paperwork. "I did not crash your party, Trey," I said coldly, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room. My tone was even betraying absolutely no emotion. I turned my attention back to the manager, extending the paperwork toward him. "I highly recommend you read the first page of that contract, Richard, before you make a decision that ends your career in hospitality permanently today." Richard hesitantly took the documents from my hand. As his eyes scanned the bold print on the first page, his face drained of all color. He swallowed hard, his hands beginning to shake slightly as he realized exactly what he was holding. He looked up at me, his expression transforming instantly from authoritative annoyance to absolute terrified subservience. "My holding company, the Vanguard Fund, acquired a 60% controlling stake in this specific hospitality group at exactly 8 o'clock yesterday morning," I announced, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the security guards and the surrounding VIP tables. "I do not just have a seat at this table, Trey. I literally own the ground you are currently standing on. I own this ballroom, I own this hotel, and I own the very security team you just tried to weaponize against me." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy donors and powerful politicians sitting at the front tables exchanged bewildered, frantic glances. They were realizing that the quiet, unassuming woman they had ignored all night was actually a financial apex predator. Kendra let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, desperately trying to cling to her fading superiority. "That is impossible," she scoffed, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "You do not have that kind of money, Valerie. You are a nobody. You are just trying to stall because you are embarrassed." I ignored Kendra completely and focused my attention solely on the hotel manager, Richard. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You failed to conduct a proper background check on the hosts of this event. You allowed my husband to use my property to publicly humiliate me, and you attempted to have the majority shareholder forcibly removed from her own building. You are officially fired. Clear out your desk immediately." Richard opened his mouth to protest, to beg for his job, but the absolute finality in my eyes silenced him. He looked down at the floor, nodded once in defeat, and quickly scurried away from the table, disappearing into the kitchen corridor without another word. I then turned my gaze to the 4 security guards who were still standing awkwardly around my table, unsure of what to do now that their manager had just been terminated on the spot. "Security," I commanded, my voice projecting undeniable authority. "You work for me now. Turn around, walk to the back of the room and lock the heavy mahogany ballroom doors. Stand guard. Nobody leaves this event until I am completely finished here." The guards did not hesitate for a single second. They immediately snapped to attention, turned on their heels, and marched swiftly toward the main exit. The heavy metal locks clicked loudly, sealing the doors shut. The sound echoed ominously through the cavernous space. The predators who had mocked me, belittled me, and tried to destroy me were now completely trapped in the room with their prey. There was no escape route left for any of them. Desmond gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles stark white. He looked out at the locked doors, the realization dawning on him that he was no longer in control of his own charity gala. The power dynamic had shifted so rapidly, so violently, that he was entirely unable to comprehend the new reality. He was a man accustomed to manipulating every situation, relying on his family name and his charismatic charm to bail him out of every disaster. But charm could not save him from a hostile corporate takeover. Trey, refusing to accept defeat, slammed his fist furiously on the table. "This is kidnapping!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot lock us in here. I am calling the Atlanta Police Department right now. You are going to federal prison for this, Valerie." Sterling, who had been standing silently by my side like an immovable force of nature, finally stepped forward. He reached into his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek silver remote. He pressed a button, and the massive LED screens behind Desmond shifted once again. "I wouldn't call the police just yet," Trey Sterling said, his deep voice radiating quiet menace. "Unless, of course, you want them to see the wire transfer receipts I'm about to display. I suggest you sit down and pay very close attention to the screens. Your family's legacy is about to get a very thorough, very public audit." The room fell into a deathly anticipatory silence. The 470 guests, the elite of Atlanta society, leaned forward in their seats. They were no longer attending a fundraising gala. They were witnessing the brutal, systematic dismantling of a corrupt dynasty. And I was just getting started. The reality of the hotel acquisition hit the St. Regis ballroom like a physical shockwave. The heavy mahogany doors remained firmly locked, guarded by the very security team Trey had just attempted to use against me. The 470 high society guests, who had spent the evening sipping champagne and laughing at my expense, were now completely silent. They were trapped inside a gilded cage, and I held the only key. Desmond stood on the stage, his breathing ragged, staring at the bankruptcy documents that had completely obliterated his false billionaire savior. He looked like a man waking up from a long, arrogant dream to find his house entirely on fire. But while Desmond was paralyzed by the total destruction of his reputation, his sister Kendra was simply incapable of accepting defeat. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on being part of Atlanta's elite. Her self-worth was entirely dependent on looking down at people like me. The idea that a former foster child was now literally dictating the terms of her existence was a reality her fragile, inflated ego categorically refused to accept. She could not comprehend that the power dynamic had shifted so permanently. Kendra sprang from her seat at table 1, her expensive designer dress swishing aggressively as she stomped toward the center of the room. "You are a lying, jealous snake, Valerie," she screamed, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill, echoing sharply through the cavernous, locked ballroom. "You are deliberately trying to destroy Black generational wealth because you never had any of your own. You are just a bitter, empty woman trying to tear down a legacy family because you know you will never truly belong here with us." I looked at Kendra, feeling absolutely no anger, only a deep, clinical pity. She was desperately clinging to a sinking ship, completely unaware of how deep the water truly was. Kendra turned her attention to the surrounding tables, seeking validation from the wealthy socialites and investors she considered her peers. "She does not know anything about real business or managing actual wealth," Kendra boasted, her voice pitching higher with desperation. "She is just trying to embarrass my brother. I built a luxury boutique in Midtown from the ground up. I know how to run a successful enterprise, unlike this pathetic housewife who just got lucky with some random investment fund. You all know me. You know my family. Do not let her manipulate you with her fake documents and her stolen money." I let her finish her frantic, desperate speech. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing her arrogant words to settle over the crowd. Then I turned slightly and gave a subtle nod to Sterling, who was standing like a sentinel near the stage. Sterling did not say a word. He simply reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick stack of sleek crimson-red folders. He walked methodically along the front row of VIP tables, handing a folder to each of the major investors and board members who had been seated near the stage. These were the men and women whose money Desmond had been courting all evening, the powerful individuals who funded his supposed charity efforts. Kendra watched Sterling pass out the folders, her confident sneer beginning to falter slightly. "What are those?" she demanded, her voice losing some of its aggressive edge. "More of your fake, manufactured garbage." I picked up the microphone again. My voice was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "Your luxury boutique hasn't sold a single designer dress in over 6 months, Kendra," I announced, ensuring every word resonated clearly through the sound system. "You haven't paid rent on your Midtown retail space since last October. Your highly praised successful enterprise is nothing but an empty, failing front." Kendra's face instantly drained of color. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny the accusation, but no sound came out. She looked frantically at her husband Trey, who had suddenly become very pale and incredibly still. I tapped my smartwatch again. The massive LED screens behind the stage shifted instantly. The bankruptcy filings disappeared, replaced immediately by highly detailed, undeniable corporate bank statements and wire transfer logs. The red text on the screen was massive, illuminating the dark ballroom with undeniable proof of their crimes. You see, I continued my gaze sweeping across the front tables, where the investors were now hastily opening their red folders. I didn't just investigate Sasha's bankrupt father. I audited the very charity fund you are all supposedly raising money for tonight. I looked closely at where the donations from the last 3 years actually went, and what I found was absolutely staggering. I pointed directly at Kendra, who was now trembling visibly. You and Trey have been systematically siphoning funds from your family's own charitable foundation. You have stolen exactly $3 million from the accounts intended for youth housing programs right here in Atlanta. And you did it tonight. You moved the money under the guise of an emergency operational expense. The investors sitting at the front tables gasped audibly. They stared at the documents in the red folders, their eyes wide with shock and rapidly building fury. They were looking at the undeniable proof that their generous donations had been stolen by the very family hosting the gala. Trey jumped up from his chair, his face slick with nervous sweat. "That is a lie," he shouted, though his voice cracked noticeably. "Those documents are forged. We used that money to secure a new community center location. It was a legitimate, authorized business transaction." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that offered absolutely no comfort. "A community center, Trey?" I asked mockingly. "Is that what you call the underground high-stakes gambling ring in Macau? Because the wire transfer receipts on the screen right behind you show the money moving directly from the charity fund into an offshore account owned by a known casino syndicate. You didn't secure a community center. You paid off your massive, crippling gambling debts." The collective outrage in the ballroom finally erupted. The wealthy donors, the political figures, and the prominent socialites realized simultaneously that they had been scammed. They had written massive checks to a family that was using their goodwill to fund a lavish, corrupt lifestyle. The betrayal was absolute, and the elite crowd was famously unforgiving when their money was stolen. Kendra's legs completely gave out. She collapsed to her knees right there on the polished marble floor, the expensive fabric of her designer dress pooling around her. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the reality of her public destruction finally hit her. She looked up desperately, seeking comfort or support from her wealthy friends at the nearby tables. But the reaction was brutal. The socialites she had spent years trying to impress, the women she considered her closest allies, actively backed away from her. They pulled their expensive gowns closer to their bodies, their faces twisted in profound, unfiltered disgust. They looked at Kendra, not just as a failure, but as a thief who had stolen from their community. She was instantly, permanently exiled from the only world she had ever cared about. Trey stood frozen, staring at his sobbing wife on the floor. He didn't bend down to help her. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply stared at the screens displaying his massive gambling debts, realizing that his Ivy League degree and his family name could not protect him from federal wire fraud charges. The golden couple of Buckhead was entirely ruined, their reputation reduced to absolute ashes in less than 5 minutes. Desmond, still standing on the stage, looked like a man watching a nightmare unfold in waking life. He had planned to use this evening to solidify his power, to humiliate me, and to secure a massive financial bailout. Instead, he was watching his entire family be systematically exposed and destroyed by the woman he had just tried to sell for $10. His company was failing, his mistress was a fraud, and his sister and brother-in-law were now confirmed embezzlers. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. I stood quietly near my table, watching the chaos I had meticulously orchestrated unfold exactly as I had planned. For 6 years I had endured their arrogance, their insults, and their endless demands for money. I had played the quiet, submissive wife while they drained my resources to fund their illusions of grandeur. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, assuming that because I didn't brag about my wealth, I didn't possess any. They thought they were the predators controlling the narrative and manipulating everyone around them. But they had failed to realize that true power doesn't need to scream for attention. True power gathers evidence, secures leverage, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight, I was not just defending myself. I was completely dismantling a corrupt dynasty that had preyed on others for far too long. The wealthy investors at the front tables began standing up, their faces red with anger. They threw the red folders onto the tables, demanding answers from Desmond. They demanded their money back, shouting threats of immediate legal action and promising to ruin the family's name in every major financial institution in the country. The charity gala had completely transformed into an angry mob demanding justice for the millions of dollars that had been stolen right under their noses. Kendra continued to sob on the floor, her wails echoing shrilly over the angry shouts of the investors. Trey looked frantically toward the locked doors, realizing that there was no way out. The security guards I had commanded stood firmly at their posts, their expressions impassive, as they watched the elite family tear itself apart. The trap was perfectly sprung, and there was absolutely no escape for any of them. The sheer volume of the outrage echoing off the marble walls of the St. Regis ballroom was deafening. The powerful investors at the front tables were completely relentless, surrounding the stage and demanding immediate answers from Desmond regarding their stolen charity funds. Trey stood paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare of his own making, while Kendra continued to sob helplessly on the floor. The locked mahogany doors stood firm, guarded by my newly acquired security team. There was absolutely no escape for any of them. The Buckhead elite were actively turning against the very dynasty they had celebrated just an hour ago. Amidst this chaotic destruction, my mother-in-law, Corinne, decided it was time to deploy her ultimate weapon. Corinne was a woman who had built an immaculate reputation across Atlanta as a devout, church-going matriarch. She served on countless charity boards and hosted lavish luncheons, always projecting the image of a selfless, deeply religious pillar of the community. Seeing her golden boy Desmond paralyzed on stage, and her daughter Kendra publicly branded as a common thief, Corinne realized her entire legacy was slipping away. She needed to stop the public massacre immediately, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the room to regain control of the narrative. Corinne suddenly let out a piercing, theatrical shriek that cut right through the shouting crowd. She grabbed the edge of her table, her face contorting in an expression of absolute agony. She clutched her chest with both hands, gasping loudly, as if the air had been sucked directly from her lungs. With a dramatic flourish, she slumped forward, knocking over a crystal vase as she collapsed heavily against the crisp white tablecloth. "My heart!" Corinne wailed, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured terror. "Somebody help me! My heart is failing right now!" The angry investors paused, their fury momentarily replaced by genuine confusion and sudden concern. A few socialites gasped loudly, taking a hesitant step forward. Corinne writhed against the table, squeezing her eyes shut and taking short, ragged breaths. She reached a shaking hand out toward the crowd, playing the role of the frail, dying victim to absolute perfection. She knew that a severe medical emergency would force the security guards to unlock the heavy doors, shut down the bright presentation screens, and end my relentless assault on her precious family. "Please call an ambulance immediately," Corinne cried out, her voice dripping with pathetic desperation. She forced a single tear to fall down her cheek. "Valerie, how can you do this to us? How can you do this to me? I took you into my home when you were absolutely nothing. You were a nobody, a lost orphan with no family and no future in this world. I gave you a warm roof over your head. I fed you. I clothed you. I treated you like my own flesh and blood, and this is how you repay a mother's boundless love. You are deliberately trying to kill me." Several guests murmured sympathetically, their eyes darting toward me with heavy judgment. Corinne was playing the martyr brilliantly, attempting to shift the narrative completely. She wanted the elite crowd to see me not as a powerful investor uncovering massive fraud, but as a vicious, ungrateful monster who was actively torturing a kind, elderly woman into a fatal heart attack. Desmond saw his mother's performance and immediately jumped on the opportunity to save himself. He rushed to the edge of the stage, pointing furiously at me. "Look what you are doing to my poor mother," Desmond shouted, his voice cracking with fake emotion. She is having a massive heart attack. Open the doors right now. Get a doctor in here immediately. You have gone way too far, Valerie. You are actually going to kill her. I stood perfectly still watching the chaotic scene unfold. I did not call for a doctor. I did not signal the security guards to open the doors. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or guilt. I knew Corinne better than anyone in this entire room, and I knew that her heart was as cold and functional as a solid steel vault. She was not dying. She was simply cornered and desperate. I set my microphone down on the table smoothly. I reached over and picked up a large, heavy crystal pitcher, filled to the absolute brim with ice water. The cold condensation dripped down the sides of the glass as I held it firmly. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the table where Corinne was currently writhing in fake agony. The large crowd parted for me, watching in stunned silence as I approached the weeping matriarch. Corinne peeked through her eyelashes, fully expecting me to apologize or offer comfort. Instead, without a single word of warning, I tilted the heavy crystal pitcher and poured the freezing ice water directly onto her face. The severe shock of the freezing water hit her instantly. Corinne let out a loud, violent gasp, her eyes flying wide open as the heavy ice cubes tumbled onto her expensive silk dress. She sputtered and coughed loudly, sitting bolt upright in her chair with astonishing speed and incredible agility for a woman who was supposedly experiencing a fatal cardiac event. The freezing water ruined her immaculate hair and caused her expensive designer mascara to run in dark streaks down her cheeks. She wiped the freezing water from her eyes, hastily glaring up at me with absolute, unfiltered rage. "You crazy woman!" Corinne shrieked loudly, completely forgetting her fragile victim persona in her anger. "Are you completely out of your mind?" The entire ballroom stared at her in utter disbelief. The wealthy donors and powerful politicians watched as the frail, dying matriarch miraculously recovered her full physical strength in less than 2 seconds. The sheer absurdity of her instantaneous cure exposed the entire dramatic performance for exactly what it was: a desperate, pathetic, and calculating lie. I picked my microphone back up, my voice steady and commanding over the speakers. "It is truly a remarkable medical miracle," I announced dryly, looking down at the dripping, furious woman. "Your heart seems to be working perfectly fine now, Corinne. But since you decided to bring up the past today, let us talk about your incredible motherly love. Let us talk about exactly why you were so eager to take in a nobody from the foster system." Corinne froze immediately, the bright anger draining from her face, replaced instantly by a creeping, deep-seated terror. She looked at the massive LED screens behind the stage, then back at me, her chest heaving heavily as she realized what I was about to do to her. "You never took me in out of love, Corinne," I said, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated ballroom. "You did not give me a home because you felt sorry for a grieving orphan girl. You took me in because you were my late father's personal accountant. You were the only person who knew exactly how much money he had quietly saved for his only daughter over the years." The elite guests leaned in closer, the atmosphere in the room thick with shock and anticipation. Desmond stared at his mother from the stage, his profound confusion evident. Even he did not know the depths of her dark deception. "When my father died unexpectedly, you saw a golden financial opportunity." I continued, pacing slowly in front of her table. "You knew I was young, alone, and completely unaware of his hidden financial assets. You took me into your expansive home to control me, to keep me close, and to ensure I would never go looking for the money he left behind. Because if I ever looked at the bank accounts, I would have discovered exactly what you did the week after his funeral." Corinne shook her head frantically, her wet hair clinging tightly to her face. "Shut up," she hissed, her voice trembling with raw panic. "Do not say another word. You are lying. You are making all of this up to ruin me." I tapped my smartwatch once again. The massive LED screens behind the stage shifted immediately. The bank statements displaying Trey and Kendra's embezzlement vanished entirely. In their place, highly detailed, undeniably official legal documents appeared. On the left side of the screen was my late father's life insurance policy, displaying a massive payout amount of exactly $2 million. On the right side of the screen were forensic handwriting analysis reports complete with bright red circles highlighting distinct, undeniable discrepancies in the written signatures. "You forged his signature, Corinne," I announced, ensuring every single guest heard the absolute truth clearly. "You stole my $2 million life insurance payout. And what did you do with the money of a grieving orphan? You used it to fund Desmond's incredibly expensive tuition at the Wharton School of Business. You used my rightful inheritance to buy your precious son a seat at the elite table. You built your entire family legacy on the money you stole directly from a grieving child." The collective gasp from the elite crowd was deafening. The hard evidence on the bright screens was completely irrefutable. The expert forensic analysis clearly demonstrated that Corinne had falsified the transfer documents. The banking records showed the $2 million moving directly from the insurance payout account into a private educational trust fund registered under Desmond's name. The entire timeline was laid out in glaring, undeniable detail for everyone in the room to see clearly. The pristine church-going high society reputation that Corinne had spent decades carefully cultivating was instantly pulverized into fine dust. The prominent women who served on prestigious charity boards with her looked at her with profound horror. Stealing from an orphaned child was a dark line that even the most ruthless members of the Buckhead elite would never cross. The disgust in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment that completely smothered Corinne. Desmond looked at his mother in absolute shock. His entire identity, his immense pride in his Ivy League education, and his arrogant belief in his own self made success had just been violently ripped away. He realized in that exact moment that everything he had achieved was built on stolen money. He was not a brilliant business prodigy at all. He was just a pathetic fraud funded entirely by the very woman he had relentlessly mocked and auctioned off for $10. Corinne slumped down heavily in her chair, the fight completely draining out of her body. She covered her wet, mascara-stained face with her shaking hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But unlike her fake heart attack, these tears were completely genuine. They were the bitter tears of a woman who knew her life in high society was permanently, irreversibly over. She would never recover from this public exposure. She would be shunned, exiled, and remembered only as a greedy, manipulative thief who preyed on a vulnerable child. I stood over her, feeling a profound sense of justice wash over me. For years I had questioned my own self-worth, believing her cruel lies, that I was just a heavy burden she had graciously taken in. I had endured her constant criticism, her demands for endless gratitude, and her relentless emotional cruelty. But the hard truth had finally set me free. I was not a charity case. I was the secret stolen foundation of their entire false empire. The power dynamic in the St. Regis ballroom was now entirely mine. Desmond was a broken fraud standing on the stage. Kendra was a sobbing embezzler sitting on the floor. Trey was exposed as a desperate gambler. And Corinne, the great matriarch, was a documented thief weeping in a puddle of cold ice water. The family had been completely dismantled, stripped of their wealth, their lies, and their dignity. But I knew the night was far from over. Desmond still clung to one last desperate hope, and I was fully prepared to crush it. The St. Regis ballroom was now a scene of absolute, uncontrolled chaos. Powerful investors and prominent socialites were shouting simultaneously, their voices echoing off the high, gilded ceilings as they demanded their stolen money back. The security guards I had just acquired stood like statues by the locked mahogany doors, ensuring that not a single person could escape the unfolding destruction. Corinne, the once mighty matriarch of the family, was still sobbing pathetically on the floor in her ruined designer dress, completely stripped of her pristine reputation after being exposed as a thief who stole an orphan's inheritance. Kendra and Trey were paralyzed by the undeniable proof of their embezzlement, realizing that their underground gambling debts were about to send them both to federal prison. But amidst all this total devastation, Desmond refused to accept that he had lost. His golden boy arrogance, the defining trait that had shielded him from reality for his entire life, kicked in with a desperate, frantic energy. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo clinging to his back as he gripped the edges of the podium. He stared out at the angry mob of investors, his mind frantically calculating a way to spin the narrative back in his favor. He could not accept that the useless wife he had just auctioned off for $10 was actually systematically dismantling his entire world. "Please, everyone, please calm down and listen to me," Desmond shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperation. He waved his arms frantically, trying to quiet the shouting crowd. "Yes, mistakes have been made tonight. Terrible, unfortunate mistakes. But you all know me. You know my family's legacy in this city. You know what I am capable of building. We can fix this situation right now." He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his eyes burning with renewed, desperate hatred. "She is just trying to cause a panic because she is a bitter, jealous woman," Desmond yelled, trying to regain his charismatic edge. "She wants to tear down what we have built because she never belonged in our world. But you are all forgetting one very important detail. You are forgetting the mega Buckhead commercial plaza." The mention of the massive real estate development caused a slight ripple of hesitation among the angry investors. The mega Buckhead project was Desmond's crown jewel, a highly publicized billion-dollar commercial and residential complex that was supposed to revolutionize the Atlanta skyline. It was the primary reason so many wealthy donors had attended this charity gala in the first place, hoping to secure lucrative contracts and early investments in the massive development. Desmond saw the slight hesitation in the crowd and immediately pounced on the opportunity. "That plaza is going to generate billions of dollars in revenue over the next decade," Desmond boasted, his voice growing louder and more confident. "The foundation is already poured. The zoning permits are entirely approved. We have pre-leased over 70% of the commercial space to top-tier luxury brands. This minor financial hiccup tonight means absolutely nothing compared to the massive profits we are about to see." He turned his attention back to me, a cruel, triumphant sneer spreading across his sweating face. "So go ahead, Valerie." Desmond mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Play your little games with the charity fund in the hotel. It doesn't matter. My new plaza will generate more than enough capital to pay everyone back 10 times over. I will crush you in court tomorrow morning. I will bury you under a mountain of elite lawyers, and when I am finished, you will be right back where you started. A pathetic, penniless orphan with absolutely nothing to her name." I stood quietly, letting him finish his desperate, arrogant speech. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing his threats to hang heavily in the tense ballroom air. I didn't feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I only felt a deep, profound satisfaction knowing that he was blindly walking right into the final inescapable trap I had set for him. I tilted my head slightly, looking at him with clinical detachment. "That plaza is indeed your golden goose." "Desmond," I said calmly, my voice projecting clearly through the sound system. "You have poured every single dime of your company's remaining assets into the construction. You have leveraged your entire family's legacy on the success of that one single project. It is a brilliant, ambitious development. I give you full credit for the vision." Desmond smirked, believing he had finally found a vulnerability in my attack. He puffed out his chest, ready to accept my surrender. But I continued, pausing deliberately. "Did you ever bother to check who actually owns the 20 acres of prime real estate you are currently building it on?" Desmond's confident smirk instantly vanished, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with renewed anxiety. "We signed a 99-year ground lease with a private holding firm over a year ago. It is an ironclad contract. The land is completely secure." I turned slightly and signaled to Sterling. Sterling did not say a word. He simply stepped forward, reaching into his tailored jacket and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. He walked methodically to the stage and handed the document directly to Desmond. Desmond snatched the paper from Sterling's hand, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. As he read the bold print, the last remaining drops of color completely drained from his face. His hands began to shake violently, the paper rattling loudly against the microphone stand. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. "Apex Holdings." I smiled, the name echoing ominously through the silent ballroom. "My primary shell company. You didn't lease that land from a faceless corporate entity, Desmond. You leased it directly from me. I have been your landlord this entire time." A collective stunned gasp swept through the 470 guests. The investors at the front table stared at me in profound awe, realizing the sheer magnitude of the long game I had been playing. I had not just been observing the family's corruption, I had been quietly, systematically buying up the very ground beneath their feet. And according to the strict terms of that ironclad contract you just mentioned, I continued, my voice cold and precise. If the lessee misses 3 consecutive ground lease payments, the landlord has the legal right to terminate the lease immediately and claim full ownership of all structures built upon the property. Desmond stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wall behind the stage for physical support. He was shaking his head frantically, trying to deny the reality of the situation. "We didn't miss any payments," he stammered weakly. "The accounting department assured me all operational expenses were fully covered." "You missed 3 consecutive payments, Desmond," I clarified sharply, "because you deliberately diverted those funds to maintain your mistress's lavish lifestyle. You chose to buy Sasha designer handbags, luxury vacations, and expensive dinners instead of paying your corporate rent. You prioritized your arrogant ego over your basic financial obligations." I stepped closer to the stage, ensuring every word landed with devastating impact. "Because of your gross negligence, I am officially terminating the ground lease effective immediately. By midnight tonight, your entire billion-dollar project, the foundation, the permits, the pre-leased contracts, legally defaults entirely to me. Your family's company is now officially worth absolute zero. You have absolutely nothing left." Desmond let out a guttural, desperate sound, a cross between a sob and a scream. The golden boy of Buckhead had finally been broken completely. He realized that he had not just lost his wealth. He had literally handed his entire billion-dollar empire directly to the woman he had spent the last 6 years treating like garbage. He had funded my ultimate victory with his own profound stupidity. The wealthy investors in the room did not offer him a single shred of sympathy. They looked at him with pure, unfiltered disgust, realizing that he was not a brilliant developer, but a reckless, incompetent fool who had gambled away their money on a mistress and a failed charity scam. The elite crowd, the people he had tried so desperately to impress, were now actively turning their backs on him. Kendra, still sobbing on the floor next to her ruined mother, buried her face in her hands. Trey stared blankly ahead, completely broken. The family dynasty that had ruled Atlanta real estate for decades had been systematically dismantled and eradicated in less than 30 minutes, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. The room waited in tense silence, knowing the night was still not over. The reality of the terminated ground lease crashed over Desmond like a physical blow. The St. Regis ballroom, packed with the most influential Black elite in Atlanta, had completely transformed from a glamorous charity gala into the epicenter of a massive financial bloodbath. The wealthy investors who had just realized their donations were stolen by Kendra and Trey were now looking at Desmond with a chilling, predatory focus. He was no longer the golden boy of a real estate dynasty. He was a ruined man, standing on a stage he didn't own, trying to defend a billion-dollar commercial plaza that had just legally defaulted to his wife. The security guards stood firmly at the locked mahogany doors, blocking any chance of retreat. The 470 guests were a captive audience to the systematic, brutal destruction of a legacy family. Desmond slumped heavily against the wooden podium, his expensive tuxedo soaked in nervous sweat, staring blankly at the single sheet of paper Sterling had handed him. The ironclad ground lease contract was real, and he had completely lost everything. But while Desmond was shattered, Trey was entirely desperate. My brother-in-law, the man who had loudly proclaimed that I was only good for braiding hair, was staring at the massive LED screens displaying his $3 million gambling debts in Macau. He knew that the investors surrounding him were not going to show mercy. They were going to call the federal authorities, and he was staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence for wire fraud. Trey had built his entire identity on his Ivy League education and his connection to Desmond's powerful family. But in a moment of pure panicked self-preservation, loyalty evaporated instantly. Trey scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over backward. The loud crash echoed through the tense ballroom, drawing every eye toward him. He raised his hands defensively, his face flushed and glistening with sweat, as he backed away from his sobbing wife, Kendra. "Listen to me!" Trey shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he addressed the angry mob of investors. "You all need to listen to me right now. I didn't orchestrate this. I am just a pawn. Desmond is the one running this entire operation. He authorized the transfer from the charity fund. He told me to move the money to cover the corporate losses." Kendra gasped, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute disbelief as she looked up from the floor at her husband. "Trey, what are you doing?" she shrieked, reaching out to grab the hem of his pants. "You are lying. You lost that money at the baccarat tables." Trey violently kicked his leg free from her grasp, stepping further away from his wife. "I had no idea the company was failing so badly." Trey continued to yell, pointing an accusing finger directly at Desmond, who was still slumped against the podium on the stage. Desmond hid the financial reports from the board. "He lied to all of you about the Mega Buckhead project, and he manipulated me into moving the charity funds to buy himself time. I was just following orders from the CEO." The cowardice was staggering. Trey was willing to throw his own brother-in-law, the head of the family, that had given him everything, directly under the bus to save his own skin. He turned back to the investors, his eyes wide and pleading. "I can fix this," Trey promised frantically, clasping his hands together in a pathetic gesture of begging. "I swear to you, I can make you all whole. I have separate private reserves. I have offshore accounts that Desmond doesn't know about. I can reimburse the charity fund completely by tomorrow morning. Just please do not call the authorities. We can handle this privately." The investors hesitated, their anger momentarily warring with their desire to recover their stolen money. Trey saw the slight softening in their expressions and pressed his advantage, offering a desperate fake smile. "Yes, offshore reserves," he repeated, nodding vigorously. "Totally liquid assets. I can wire the money back immediately. Just give me 24 hours to access the accounts." I stood quietly near my table, watching Trey spin his pathetic web of lies. He really believed he could manipulate his way out of a federal crime by promising money he had already stolen. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, relying on the classic defense of the arrogant and the desperate. But he had fundamentally underestimated the depth of my investigation. I hadn't just audited the charity fund or tracked the casino payments. I had followed every single dollar Trey had touched for the past 3 years. I picked up the microphone, my voice cutting through his frantic promises with surgical precision. "Offshore reserves in the Bahamas." Trey asked, my tone dripping with icy condescension. Trey froze, his fake smile instantly vanishing as he whipped his head around to look at me. His eyes darted nervously between me and the massive LED screens behind the stage. "How do you know about the Bahamas?" he stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. I tapped my smartwatch deliberately. The massive screens shifted instantly. The gambling receipts disappeared, replaced by a series of highly detailed, undeniably official banking documents from a private institution in Nassau. The red text on the screen was enormous, illuminating the dark ballroom with absolute proof of his deception. "You mean the accounts you opened under the name Maya Sterling?" I continued, ensuring every single guest heard the name clearly. "Because according to the wire transfer logs displayed right behind you, you haven't been saving money to reimburse these investors. You have been actively funneling the stolen charity funds into those offshore accounts for over 2 years. Trey's face drained of all color. He looked like he was going to vomit right there on the polished marble floor. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another lie, but the sheer volume of evidence on the screen was completely irrefutable. The banking documents clearly showed millions of dollars moving from the Atlanta Charity Fund directly into the Bahamian accounts. But I was not finished. I was about to deliver a double homicide of a reveal that would completely destroy whatever fragments of his life remained. "And who exactly is Mia Sterling Trey?" I asked, stepping closer to his table. "Because she certainly isn't a corporate vendor or a legitimate business partner." Kendra slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her makeup completely ruined, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying suspicion. "Trey," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Who is Maya?" I didn't wait for him to answer. I tapped my smartwatch one final time. The bank statements on the screen shifted, revealing a series of high-resolution photographs and legal property deeds. The images showed a stunning multi-million-dollar beachfront property in Miami, Florida. But it was the photographs next to the deed that caused the entire ballroom to gasp in absolute shock. The photos clearly showed Trey walking hand in hand on the beach with a beautiful, much younger woman. And in his other arm, he was holding a toddler who looked exactly like him. "Maya Sterling is the mother of your 2-year-old son, Trey," I announced, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "While Kendra has been busy bullying me and trying to maintain the image of the perfect elite Buckhead marriage, you have been funding a secret second family in Miami, using the money you stole from the youth housing charity." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating terror. The elite crowd stared at the screens, their mouths hanging open in profound disbelief. The golden couple of Atlanta high society had just been exposed in the most brutal, humiliating way possible. Trey was not just a thief and a gambler. He was a spectacular, unrepentant traitor to his own wife. Kendra stared at the massive photographs of her husband holding another woman's child. The reality of his ultimate betrayal shattered her completely. The fragile, arrogant ego she had used to protect herself for years instantly snapped. She let out a scream so loud, so filled with raw, primal agony, that it echoed painfully through the cavernous ballroom. "You bastard!" Kendra shrieked, launching herself at Trey with blinding speed. She didn't care about the 470 wealthy guests watching. She didn't care about the security guards or the locked doors. She physically attacked her husband right there in the middle of the St. Regis ballroom. She slapped him across the face with tremendous force, her diamond rings leaving bright red scratches across his cheek. She pounded her fists against his chest, sobbing and screaming obscenities as she tore at his expensive tuxedo. Trey tried to shield his face, stumbling backward as his wife viciously assaulted him. "Kendra, stop, please," he begged, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I can explain. It isn't what it looks like." But there was no explaining away the photographs or the bank statements. The elite family, the dynasty that had prided itself on black excellence and superiority, was now literally tearing each other apart in front of the very people they had tried to impress. The investors watched in stunned silence, realizing that the people they had trusted with their money were fundamentally corrupt, morally bankrupt monsters. The destruction was absolute, and the night was far from over. The St. Regis ballroom was now a scene of absolute uncontrolled chaos. Powerful investors and prominent socialites were shouting simultaneously, their voices echoing off the high gilded ceilings as they demanded their stolen money back. The security guards I had just acquired stood like statues by the locked mahogany doors, ensuring that not a single person could escape the unfolding destruction. Corinne, the once mighty matriarch of the family, was still sobbing pathetically on the floor in her ruined designer dress, completely stripped of her pristine reputation after being exposed as a thief who stole an orphan's inheritance. Kendra and Trey were paralyzed by the undeniable proof of their embezzlement, realizing that their underground gambling debts were about to send them both to federal prison. But amidst all this total devastation, Sasha had been cowering near the edge of the stage, her rented emerald gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She had watched in absolute horror as the Vanguard Fund dismantled every single lie Desmond had told her. The billionaire lifestyle she thought she had secured was nothing but smoke and mirrors. Desmond was completely penniless. His billion-dollar commercial plaza now belonged to me. His family was facing federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Sasha was a professional social climber, a woman who only attached herself to men who could elevate her status and fund her extravagant tastes. Seeing Desmond stripped of his wealth and power, she realized she was shackled to a sinking ship. She needed an exit strategy, and she needed it immediately. Panic set in as she looked at the furious investors who were still demanding their stolen money back. She knew they would start looking for accomplices, and she had just loudly announced her fake $50 million pledge to the entire room. Sasha decided to play the only card she had left. She was going to throw Desmond completely under the bus to save herself. She pushed herself away from the wall, her face slick with nervous sweat, and stepped back into the spotlight. Sasha forced tears into her eyes, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured terror as she addressed the angry crowd. "Please, you have to believe me," Sasha cried out, holding her hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "I had no idea about any of this. I am a victim here too. Desmond manipulated me. He told me he was a billionaire. He promised me we were going to build an empire together. He lied to me just like he lied to all of you." Desmond whipped his head around, staring at his mistress in profound disbelief. "Sasha, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You cannot do this to me." "Stay away from me," Sasha shrieked, backing away from him as if he were covered in a deadly virus. "You are a monster, Desmond. You are a broke, pathetic fraud, and I am not going to federal prison for your pathetic charity scams. I am completely innocent." The elite investors scoffed at her pathetic display. They were not buying her victim routine for a single second. They had just watched her parade around the ballroom, bragging about her fake wealth and insulting my background. They began shouting at her, demanding to know where her fake billionaire father was hiding. Sasha realized her tears were not working. The crowd was turning on her just as fiercely as they had turned on Trey and Kendra. In a desperate, frantic bid for absolute immunity, she decided to detonate the largest explosive she had in her arsenal. She turned toward me, her eyes wide with a manic, terrified energy. "Valerie, you have to listen to me," Sasha screamed over the noise of the angry mob. "I am trying to help you. I am trying to save your life." I stood perfectly still, my expression completely unreadable as I looked down at the panicking mistress. I did not ask her to continue, but she was entirely incapable of stopping herself. "He was going to kill you, Valerie!" Sasha shrieked, her voice echoing painfully through the ballroom sound system. "He was planning your murder. He took out a $15 million life insurance policy on you just last week. He told me he was going to stage a home invasion to get rid of you, so we could keep all the money and the properties for ourselves. He is a murderer. A collective horrifying gasp erupted from the 470 guests. The anger over the stolen charity funds instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. The wealthy donors and politicians recoiled, staring at Desmond as if he had just transformed into a literal demon right in front of their eyes. Wire fraud and embezzlement were white-collar crimes that the Buckhead elite could comprehend. But premeditated, cold-blooded murder was a line that shattered the very foundation of their high society world. Desmond's face contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. The exposure of his darkest, most sinister secret pushed him completely over the edge of sanity. "Shut your mouth, you stupid woman!" Desmond roared with a terrifying, primal fury. He lunged violently across the stage, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human decency. He aimed directly for Sasha, his hands outstretched, desperate to wrap his fingers around her throat and silence her before she could reveal any more of his deadly, calculated plans. The crowd screamed in panic as the disgraced heir turned violent right before their eyes. Sterling moved effortlessly. He stepped smoothly into Desmond's path, intercepting the frantic charge with brutal efficiency. Sterling drove his forearm directly into Desmond's chest, halting his momentum instantly, and shoved him violently backward. Desmond crashed hard against the wooden podium, gasping for breath as the heavy wood splintered behind him. Sterling stood between Desmond and Sasha, an immovable wall of highly trained security, ensuring Desmond could not take another step forward. Sasha cowered behind Sterling, sobbing hysterically as she looked at me, begging for validation. "I told you the truth, Valerie," Sasha cried, pointing a shaking finger at Desmond. "I saved your life. You have to tell the police I cooperated. You have to let me go." I smoothed the front of my black silk gown, feeling absolutely no shock, no fear, and no surprise at her horrific revelation. I simply picked up the microphone from my table. "I know, Sasha. I said, my voice cutting through the hysterical panic in the room with absolute chilling calm. Sasha stopped sobbing, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "You know?" she asked, her voice dropping to a bewildered whisper. "Of course I know," I replied, stepping closer to the stage to ensure Desmond heard every single word I was about to say. "Desmond, did you honestly believe you could take out a $15 million life insurance policy on a high-net-worth venture capitalist without triggering a dozen different financial red flags?" Desmond stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a sickening realization. "Who do you think owns the insurance underwriting firm you bought that policy from?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. The ballroom fell into a dead, captivated silence. Desmond's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the terrifying scope of the financial empire I had secretly built entirely around him. Vanguard Holdings acquired a majority stake in that specific underwriting firm 2 years ago. I explained, my tone strictly professional, as if I were conducting a routine board meeting instead of dismantling a murder plot. "The moment your application hit their system, my risk assessment team flagged it and sent it directly to my personal secure server. I read your entire pathetic plan before the ink on your signature was even dry." Desmond slid slowly down the front of the broken podium, his knees finally giving out completely. He landed heavily on the stage floor, a broken, defeated monster, realizing he had been outplayed at every conceivable level. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to ensure he understood exactly how powerless he truly was. "You also forgot one crucial detail about life insurance," Desmond, I continued mercilessly. "The policy is only valid if the initial premium clears the bank. And since I had my wealth management team freeze every single one of your personal and corporate credit lines 3 weeks ago, your premium payment bounced entirely. The policy you thought would fund your new life with your mistress was officially rendered null and void yesterday afternoon. You were plotting a murder for a payout that literally did not exist." The sheer embarrassing stupidity of his failed murder plot hung heavily in the air. The elite crowd looked at him with profound disgust and disbelief. He was not just a criminal, he was a spectacularly incompetent failure who could not even successfully execute a fraudulent insurance scheme. Sasha, seeing that her big dramatic reveal had provided her with absolutely no leverage, realized she had completely exhausted her options. I already knew everything she had to offer, and she was still standing in a locked room surrounded by angry investors who wanted her arrested for participating in Desmond's fraudulent schemes. She turned frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. Seeing the security guards standing firm, she realized she could not escape through the main entrance. Panic consumed her. She picked up the heavy skirts of her rented emerald green designer gown and bolted toward the rear kitchen corridors, desperately hoping to find an unlocked service exit to flee the hotel before the police arrived. I watched her sprint toward the service doors, my expression entirely unbothered. "Run all you want, Sasha," I noted coldly into the microphone, my voice following her panicked retreat. "But you are not going to get very far tonight. Your rented Bentley is currently being towed from the hotel valet line due to non-payment, and I made sure to personally cancel your rideshare account this morning." Sasha froze at the edge of the kitchen corridor, her shoulders slumping in absolute total defeat. She had no money, no transportation, no billionaire father, and nowhere to hide. She was completely trapped in the luxurious prison I had meticulously designed for all of them. The predators who had mocked my background and plotted my demise were now entirely at my mercy, and I had absolutely zero intention of letting any of them walk away unpunished. The destruction was comprehensive, but the final definitive blow was still yet to come. The explosive revelation about the terminated ground lease was the absolute final straw. The St. Regis ballroom, filled with the most influential members of Atlanta's black elite, transformed instantly into a theater of unmitigated corporate warfare. The wealthy investors and prominent socialites who had just witnessed the systematic destruction of Desmond's family were no longer just angry. They were utterly, violently furious. They had been scammed, lied to, and humiliated by a man they thought was their peer. At the front of the room, seated at the primary VIP tables, were the 6 members of the board of directors for Desmond's century-old family business. These were powerful, deeply entrenched men and women who had spent their entire lives protecting the legacy of their firm. They had trusted Desmond to lead them into a new era of prosperity with the Mega Buckhead project. Now they were staring at a future involving federal prison sentences for massive wire fraud and embezzlement, all because they had blindly followed a reckless, incompetent heir. The chairman of the board, a formidable man named Harrison, pushed his chair back with a loud, aggressive screech that cut through the chaotic noise of the room. He was 70 years old, a veteran of countless brutal corporate battles, and he looked at Desmond with a cold, terrifying rage that made the younger man physically recoil. Harrison did not use a microphone. He didn't need to. His booming, authoritative voice projected clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, commanding absolute attention from every single person present. Desmond Harrison roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the tables. You have single-handedly bankrupted an 80-year-old institution in less than 24 months. You have implicated this entire board in federal fraud, and you have gambled away our legacy on a pathetic mistress and an underground casino. Desmond held up his hands, his face slick with nervous sweat, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny fragment of control he had left. Harrison, please, you have to understand. Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking horribly. The market shifted. The capital got tied up. I was just trying to buy us some time. We can restructure the debt. We can fix this. Harrison slammed his fist down on the table with explosive force, shattering a plate. Do not insult my intelligence with your pathetic lies, Desmond, he thundered, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated contempt. There is no restructuring. There is no fixing this. You have completely lost the land under our primary asset, and you have stolen millions from a registered charity. The chairman took a deep breath, his expression hardening into absolute merciless resolve. On behalf of the board of directors, by the emergency powers vested in me by our corporate charter, I am formally stripping you of your title. You are officially fired as CEO effective immediately. You are permanently removed from all operational duties, and we will be pursuing aggressive civil litigation against you for gross negligence and catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. The finality of Harrison's words hung heavily in the air. Desmond stumbled backward, physically shrinking as the last remaining pillar of his identity was violently ripped away. He was no longer the golden boy. He was no longer a CEO. He was just a disgraced, ruined criminal facing massive lawsuits and federal prison. But Harrison was not finished. He knew that firing Desmond did not solve the immediate critical problem. The board members were still facing imminent federal indictments for the charity fraud, and the company was still entirely bankrupt. They needed a miracle, and they needed it right now. Harrison slowly turned away from the pathetic, broken man on the stage. He adjusted his suit jacket, took a deep breath to compose himself, and walked directly toward my table. The entire ballroom watched in stunned fascination as the powerful chairman of the board approached me, the woman they had all been mocking just an hour ago. Valerie, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate plea as he stood before me. I know what this family has done to you. I know how terribly you have been treated, and I offer my most profound, sincere apologies. But the people on this board, we had absolutely no idea about the embezzlement. We were completely blinded by his lies. He gestured frantically toward the other 5 board members, who were all nodding vigorously, their faces pale with terror. We are facing federal indictments, Valerie. We are facing the complete destruction of our lives because of his profound stupidity. We need your help. We need a bailout. Harrison swallowed hard, his pride completely abandoned in the face of imminent ruin. Your Vanguard fund has the capital. You have the leverage. We are begging you, Valerie. Buy us out. Save this company. Save us from going to federal prison. The irony of the situation was absolutely exquisite. For 6 years, Desmond and his family had treated me like a useless, uneducated burden. They had told me I was incapable of understanding their complex, high-level business operations. Now, the chairman of their board was literally begging me to save their entire empire from total annihilation. I remained seated, my expression completely unreadable as I looked up at the desperate, sweating man. I did not immediately answer. I let the silence stretch, allowing the sheer desperation of his request to settle heavily over the room. I wanted them to feel the full crushing weight of their precarious situation. Finally, I picked up my microphone. The sound of my calm, measured voice echoed clearly through the ballroom. I will agree to a complete buyout of all board shares, I announced, ensuring every single guest heard my decision. I will assume full control of the company, and I will personally reimburse the stolen charity funds, which will effectively eliminate the immediate threat of federal wire fraud charges against the board. A collective, massive sigh of relief washed over the board members. Harrison actually closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the immediate terror of prison began to fade. They thought they had secured an easy escape route. They thought I was going to be the gracious, forgiving savior. They were profoundly, terribly mistaken. But I continued, my voice suddenly turning ice cold, cutting through their premature relief like a scalpel. My offer comes with a non-negotiable, absolute condition. The board members froze, their relief instantly evaporating as they stared at me with renewed anxiety. Harrison nodded slowly, bracing himself for the impact. "Name your terms, Valerie," he said quietly. "We are in no position to negotiate." I stood up, ensuring that I commanded the full attention of the entire room. "You allowed Desmond to run this company into the ground because you were too cowardly to challenge him," I stated firmly, my gaze sweeping across the 6 board members. "You ignored the glaring financial discrepancies because it was easier to look the other way. You are complicit in this failure, and you will not walk away from it with a profit." I turned my attention directly to Harrison, my eyes locking onto his. "I will execute a complete hostile takeover of this 80-year-old empire tonight. But I am not paying market value. I am not even paying liquidation value." I paused, letting the silence build for maximum impact. "I will buy your equity for exactly 10 cents on the dollar," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding finality. The room gasped loudly. 10 cents on the dollar was not just a lowball offer, it was a brutal, intentional financial massacre. It meant the board members would lose almost all of their invested wealth, walking away with mere pennies compared to what their shares were once worth. Harrison stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, as he struggled to process the devastating terms. "Valerie, that is a total wipeout," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You are asking us to surrender decades of built wealth for practically nothing." I tilted my head slightly, my expression entirely devoid of mercy or compassion. 10 cents, Harrison," I repeated softly, pointing directly at Desmond, who was still slumped brokenly on the stage. "That is exactly the price Desmond thought I was worth when he auctioned me off to this room. I think it is only fair that I value his entire company at the exact same rate." The poetic justice of the offer hung heavily in the air. The crowd was completely silent, realizing that I was not just executing a financial transaction, I was delivering a perfectly calculated symbolic execution of the entire family's legacy. Harrison looked back at the other board members. They were trapped. They had absolutely no leverage, no other buyers, and no time. If they refused my offer, the company would default on the land lease by midnight, rendering their shares entirely worthless anyway. And without my reimbursement of the charity funds, they would all be facing federal indictments by tomorrow morning. They were cornered, desperate, and completely out of options. Harrison closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "We accept your terms," he whispered, the fight completely draining out of his body. "We accept 10 cents on the dollar." I nodded smoothly. Sterling, who had been anticipating this exact outcome, immediately pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket. He quickly generated the digital equity transfer contracts, coding the brutal 10 cents on the dollar valuation into the binding legal agreements. He walked methodically along the front tables, handing the tablet to each of the 6 board members. One by one, with trembling fingers and expressions of profound, crushing defeat, they signed away their shares. They digitally transferred the entire 80-year-old family empire directly to my holding company. I stood quietly watching the process complete. In under 5 minutes, I had flawlessly executed a hostile corporate takeover. I had legally stripped Desmond's family of their entire legacy, their wealth and their power, all while they sat trapped in a locked ballroom. I was no longer the useless wife. I was the undisputed absolute owner of their entire world, and the final stage of my revenge was about to commence. The digital ink was barely dry on the equity transfer contracts before the reality of his total erasure finally snapped the last fragile thread of Desmond's sanity. He stood alone near the splintered remains of the mahogany podium. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo was soaked in sweat. His breath hitched in ragged, shallow gasps. He watched the 6 board members of his former century-old empire physically step away from him and align themselves behind my table. In less than 5 minutes, I had stripped him of his title, his company, his wealth, and his legacy. He had nothing left to leverage and no one left to manipulate. The charismatic golden boy facade completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. Desmond's eyes darted frantically around the St. Regis ballroom. He saw his mother, Corinne, weeping in a puddle of freezing water. He saw his sister, Kendra, being physically restrained by hotel security after attacking her husband, Trey. He saw the empty space where his mistress, Sasha, had desperately tried to flee. Finally, his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I sat perfectly composed in my black silk gown, the undisputed owner of the very ground beneath his feet. The profound silence of the room was shattered by a sound I had never heard him make before. It was a feral, guttural scream that tore through his throat. It was the sound of ultimate defeat curdling into violent, unpredictable rage. Desmond lunged toward the nearest VIP table, his hand wrapped violently around the neck of a heavy, solid crystal champagne bottle. He hoisted it high above his shoulder, the faceted glass catching the light of the massive overhead chandeliers. "You completely ruined my life," he roared, spit flying from his lips as he charged directly at me. He bypassed the terrified investors, his heavy dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor, but quickly regaining traction. His intention was absolutely clear. He was aiming to smash the heavy crystal bottle directly over my head. He wanted to physically break the woman who had just financially and socially annihilated him. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not even blink or raise my hands to protect my face. I simply looked at him with cold, clinical detachment. I knew exactly what kind of man Desmond truly was. A pathetic coward who only resorted to violence when all his lies were exposed and his power was completely stripped away. He was a weak man throwing a final pathetic tantrum because the foster system charity case he had mocked was now his absolute master. Before Desmond could even close half the distance between us, Sterling moved. He did not rush or stumble. He moved with a terrifying, lethal military-grade speed that seemed almost impossible for a man of his size in a formal tuxedo. Sterling stepped smoothly into the direct path of the charging, screaming heir. Desmond swung the heavy crystal bottle down with all his remaining strength, aiming directly for a devastating blow. Sterling effortlessly deflected the strike. He raised his left forearm, catching Desmond's wrist mid-swing with a sickening crack that echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. Desmond dropped the bottle instantly. The heavy crystal hit the marble floor and shattered into hundreds of glittering shards, spraying expensive champagne across the polished stone. Before Desmond could even register the agonizing pain in his wrist, Sterling pivoted fluidly. He grabbed Desmond's extended arm, twisted it violently behind his back, and applied a brutal, agonizing amount of pressure. Desmond let out a high-pitched shriek as his shoulder joint was pushed to the absolute breaking point. Sterling did not pause. Using Desmond's own forward momentum against him, Sterling swept his right leg and slammed the former CEO face first onto the unforgiving marble floor. The impact was brutal and completely undeniable. Desmond's face bounced off the hard stone with a wet, heavy thud. A collective gasp swept through the 470 high society guests. Sterling knelt smoothly, keeping his knee pressed firmly into the center of Desmond's spine, pinning him to the ground like a common street criminal. He held Desmond's twisted arm locked securely in place, rendering the once truly powerful billionaire completely immobile and utterly helpless. Desmond groaned in agony. Bright red blood immediately began pooling beneath his face, dripping steadily from a busted lip and a fractured nose. It stained the crisp white collar of his custom-tailored shirt and smeared across the pristine marble floor. He blindly writhed pathetically under Sterling's weight, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears mixed with the blood and the spilled champagne, creating a humiliating puddle around his face. "Please," Desmond choked out, his voice muffled against the cold stone. "Please let me go. You are breaking my arm. Please, Valerie, make him stop. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything." I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my silk gown, stepping carefully around the shattered crystal shards. I looked down at the man who had just auctioned me off for $10. The man who had mocked my background, stolen my inheritance, and plotted my murder. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable prince of elite Buckhead. He was just a bloody crying mess groveling at my feet. I looked out at the massive ballroom. 470 of the most powerful black elites, the politicians, the investors, the socialites, who had laughed at his cruel jokes just an hour ago, were now standing in absolute silence. They were not moving to help him. They were not calling for security to intervene. Instead, hundreds of smartphones were held high in the air. The elite crowd was actively recording every single second of his humiliating downfall. The golden boy of the city was now nothing but a pathetic joke, a viral cautionary tale being broadcast to the entire world in high definition. I walked closer until the toes of my Louboutin heels were mere inches from his bleeding face. I crouched down gracefully, making sure my voice would only carry to him and the phones recording in the front row. "You begged this room to buy your useless wife for $10, Desmond," I whispered coldly. "You wanted a spectacle. You wanted everyone to laugh at the poor orphan girl who was lucky to even be in your presence. Well, congratulations. You finally gave them a show they will never forget. But nobody is laughing at me now." Desmond squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head weakly to avoid my gaze. His shoulders shook with loud, pathetic sobs. The flashing cameras from the guests' smartphones illuminated his ruined face in rapid, blinding bursts of light. The heavily locked ballroom doors suddenly burst open with tremendous force. The security guards I had ordered to lock the room stepped aside smoothly. A team of federal agents swarmed into the St. Regis ballroom. Their badges prominently displayed their tactical gear, a stark contrast to the luxurious formal wear of the elite guests. They moved with coordinated precision, securing the perimeter and moving directly toward the stage where the fractured family was currently falling apart. Trey tried to run toward the kitchen corridor, but two agents tackled him instantly, slamming him against the wall and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Kendra screamed hysterically as an agent read her the Miranda rights, citing federal wire fraud and embezzlement of charity funds. Corinne, completely dropping her fragile elderly woman act, tried to fight off the female agent, arresting her for grand larceny and identity theft. Her pristine church-going image was entirely shattered as she cursed loudly, kicking and thrashing in her ruined designer gown. Two lead federal agents approached Sterling and Desmond. Sterling released his brutal grip, stepping back seamlessly as the agents hauled Desmond roughly to his feet. Desmond staggered, his legs barely able to support his own weight. Blood dripped steadily from his chin onto his ruined tuxedo jacket. The cold, heavy metal handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, a definitive echoing sound that signaled the absolute end of his falsely privileged existence. He did not speak a single word to me or anyone else. His arrogant blue eyes were completely shattered, hollowed out by the crushing weight of total defeat. He looked at me one final time, offering absolutely nothing left to say. The agents marched him aggressively through the parted crowd of awestruck elites. The wealthy donors and powerful politicians physically backed away in disgust, ensuring his bleeding face did not ruin their expensive clothing. I stood tall in the center of my newly acquired ballroom. The toxic dynasty was eradicated. The abusers who had underestimated my worth were heading to federal prison. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp Atlanta air. The silence in the room was no longer suffocating or oppressive. It was now deeply respectful. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute unconditional victory. The mahogany doors crashed open. The grand ballroom instantly transformed into a chaotic federal crime scene. Over 40 armed agents from the FBI and the IRS flooded the space. Their dark tactical gear cut a harsh contrast against the crystal chandeliers. The soft jazz was abruptly cut off, replaced by authoritative barks, demanding absolute compliance. "Nobody move! Keep your hands where we can see them!" The lead agent bellowed, his voice amplified by a megaphone. The 470 members of Atlanta's high society, the untouchable elite who believed their wealth shielded them from consequences, froze in sheer terror. Socialites shrieked and dropped their champagne flutes. The fragile glass shattered across the marble floors. Wealthy donors instinctively backed away from the VIP tables, treating my former family like a contagious disease. Corinne remained at my feet, her expensive dress soaked in the freezing ice water I had poured over her fake heart attack just minutes prior. The matriarch who had stolen my father's life insurance payout looked up at the swarming federal agents with wide, unblinking eyes. The reality of her impending imprisonment finally penetrated her deeply ingrained arrogance. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the wet marble, desperate to escape the consequences of her own greed. "Valerie, please," Corinne sobbed, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "You cannot let them take me. I am an old woman. I will not survive in federal prison. We are family. You have to fix this right now." I looked down at the woman who had forged my late father's signature to steal my $2 million inheritance. I felt absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. "No, you did not care about family unity when you stole an orphaned child's inheritance, Corinne," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the sudden silence of the room. "You did not care about my survival when you watched your son auction me off like a piece of livestock for $10. You built your entire pristine church-going reputation on stolen money. Now you are going to pay the exact price for your hypocrisy." Two female FBI agents approached us swiftly, their expressions completely devoid of sympathy. They hauled Corinne roughly to her feet. The great matriarch of Buckhead society immediately lost any remaining shred of her dignified facade. She began to thrash violently, kicking her expensive heels and screaming obscenities that would have horrified her charity board colleagues. The agents were entirely unbothered by her theatrics. They swiftly twisted her arms behind her back, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing loudly. Corinne wept hysterically as they read her the Miranda rights. A few feet away, chaos erupted at table 1. Trey, my arrogant brother-in-law, had just been exposed for siphoning $3 million from the youth charity fund to pay off his underground gambling debts in Macau, all while funding a secret second family in Miami. Seeing the federal agents advancing toward him, Trey panicked completely. The Ivy League business degree he flaunted so proudly offered absolutely no protection against an airtight federal indictment. He abandoned his sobbing wife Kendra and made a frantic, desperate dash toward the kitchen service corridors. He did not make it past the first row of tables. Sterling, who had been anticipating this exact cowardly maneuver, simply extended his foot. Trey tripped spectacularly, crashing face first into a linen-draped table and bringing a towering floral arrangement down on top of himself. Before Trey could even attempt to scramble away, 3 heavily armed IRS agents were on top of him. They pinned him to the floor, driving their knees into his back to subdue his frantic struggles. "I can pay it back!" Trey screamed, his face smashed against the polished marble, his voice muffled by the scattered rose petals and broken china. "I have the offshore accounts in the Bahamas. I have the money. You do not understand. I was just following orders. Desmond made me do it. I will testify against him right now. Just let me go." The agents ignored his pathetic bargaining. They secured the handcuffs and yanked him up to his feet. Kendra, still sitting on the floor with her ruined makeup, watched her husband offer to testify against her own brother to save his own skin. The ultimate betrayal completely paralyzed her. She did not even flinch when an agent handed her a subpoena officially naming her as an unindicted co-conspirator in the charity fraud scheme. Her luxury boutique was a front, her husband was a traitor, and her high society life was permanently destroyed. The lead FBI agent marched directly onto the stage where my soon-to-be ex-husband was currently pinned to the floor. Sterling released his brutal grip, stepping back seamlessly as the agents hauled Desmond roughly to his feet. The charismatic golden boy of Atlanta real estate was completely unrecognizable. Blood dripped steadily from his busted lip, staining the crisp white collar of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. His expensive clothes were ruined. His billion-dollar mega Buckhead commercial plaza now legally belonged to my holding company, and his fraudulent empire was completely eradicated. The federal agent held up a thick, meticulously organized dossier. It was a physical copy of the exact audit reports I had submitted to the Department of Justice 30 days ago. The documents detailed every single illegal wire transfer, every forged lease agreement, and every instance of massive tax evasion Desmond had orchestrated to keep his sinking company afloat over the past 5 years. Desmond Sterling, the lead agent announced, his voice projecting clearly across the silent, captivated ballroom. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, embezzlement of charitable funds, and conspiracy to commit murder for insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Desmond swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of the federal charges. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and prominent socialites he had spent his entire life trying to impress. They were not looking back at him with admiration or respect. Hundreds of smartphones were raised high in the air, recording his bloody, humiliating downfall in high definition. The elite crowd was actively documenting the total destruction of his legacy to share with the rest of the world. He was officially a viral cautionary tale. Desmond slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes finding mine one final time. There was no arrogant smirk left, no condescending sneer, and no false confidence. There was only absolute, profound terror. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for mercy, but the words died in his throat. He finally realized that the woman he had underestimated, mocked, and attempted to sell for $10 had systematically orchestrated his entire demise with flawless, lethal precision. "Take him out," the lead agent ordered sharply. The federal officers marched Desmond, Trey, and Corinne aggressively through the center of the massive ballroom. The crowd parted instantly, actively stepping away to avoid touching the disgraced family. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind them, sealing their fate and signaling the absolute end of their reign over Atlanta's high society. The room remained completely silent for a long moment, the shock of the violent, rapid escalation still settling over the guests. The 6 board members who had just sold me their entire company equity for 10 cents on the dollar stood frozen near the stage, realizing how narrowly they had escaped wearing those same steel handcuffs. I smoothed the front of my black silk gown, feeling a profound sense of liberation wash over me. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be less than I was, of hiding my wealth, and shrinking my intellect to protect their fragile egos, was finally gone. I walked slowly to the center of the room, my Louboutin heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I picked up the microphone from my table. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice calm, authoritative, and entirely in control. "I apologize for the dramatic interruption to your evening. The Vanguard Fund takes corporate corruption and charity fraud incredibly seriously. As the new majority shareholder of this hospitality group and the new absolute owner of the former Sterling real estate empire, I assure you that all stolen charitable funds will be fully reimbursed by tomorrow morning." A sudden, spontaneous wave of applause erupted from the front tables. The wealthy investors, relieved that their money was safe, looked at me with newfound profound respect. "This event is officially concluded," I announced. "Please drive safely." I set the microphone down and turned away from the crowd. Sterling fell into step right beside me, a silent, imposing guardian. We walked together out of the St. Regis ballroom, leaving the shattered remnants of my past life behind me. The crisp Atlanta night air felt incredible against my skin. I had lost a toxic family, but I had gained an absolute empire, and my true life was only just beginning. I had lost a toxic family, but I had gained an absolute empire, and my true life was only just beginning. But before I could fully cross the threshold of those heavy mahogany doors and leave the St. Regis ballroom behind forever, a pathetic strangled wail echoed through the cavernous space. The sound was so raw, so entirely devoid of dignity, that it forced me to stop and turn around. The federal agents were not gentle. Two heavily armed FBI officers grabbed Desmond by the collar of his ruined, blood-stained Tom Ford tuxedo, hauling him roughly up to his feet. His knees buckled immediately. He lacked the physical strength to support his own weight, as the reality of his total destruction finally crashed down upon him. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs, snapping tightly around his wrists, echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. That sound was the definitive end of his freedom. Desmond began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved violently as he gasped for air, his eyes wide and wild with unadulterated panic. The golden boy of Atlanta real estate, the arrogant man who had strutted onto that stage an hour ago believing he was untouchable, was now completely reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating shell. He looked desperately around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy investors and elite socialites he had spent years trying to impress. They offered him nothing but disgust, their smartphone cameras still raised high, documenting his ultimate disgrace. Realizing that his peers had entirely abandoned him, his frantic gaze darted across the room until it locked firmly onto me. I was standing near the exit, perfectly calm, framed by the chaos I had meticulously orchestrated. "Valerie, please!" Desmond screamed, his voice cracking horribly as the federal agents began to drag him forward. He planted his expensive dress shoes against the polished marble floor, physically fighting the officers in a desperate, futile attempt to reach me. "You cannot do this. You cannot just leave me like this. Please, Valerie, I am begging you." I did not move. I simply watched his pathetic struggle with cold, clinical detachment. "We took vows, Valerie." He sobbed, tears streaming freely down his bruised and bleeding face, mixing with the sweat and spilled champagne. "In sickness and in health, remember, for richer or for poorer, you promised to always stand by me. I am your husband. I still love you. I have always loved you. I was just stressed. I was drowning in corporate debt and I lost my mind. But we can fix this. We have the money now. We can pay everyone back and start over. Just you and me. Please, baby, give me one more chance." The sheer absolute audacity of his plea hung heavily in the tense ballroom air. Less than 2 hours ago, this very same man had stood at a mahogany podium, laughed at my foster care background, and offered to sell me to a room full of judging strangers for a $10 bill. He had plotted my murder for an insurance payout to fund a life with his rented mistress. And now, facing the brutal consequences of his own arrogance, he dared to invoke the sacred wedding vows he had spent 6 years systematically destroying. I turned away from the exit doors and walked slowly back toward the center of the room. The sea of wealthy guests parted instantly, granting me a wide, unobstructed path. The federal agents paused their forward momentum, holding Desmond firmly in place, but allowing me to closely approach. Desmond looked up at me, with raw, desperate hope shining in his red-rimmed eyes. He actually believed that his pathetic tears and hollow declarations of love could manipulate me one last time. He thought the quiet, submissive wife was still trapped somewhere inside me, ready to forgive his unforgivable sins. He was profoundly mistaken. I stepped up to my trembling, handcuffed husband. The height difference was usually in his favor, but right now, forced to his knees by the federal agents, he had to look up at me. I maintained perfect eye contact, letting him see the absolute icy void where my deep love for him used to reside. I reached a calm, steady hand into my black designer clutch. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe his tears. I did not pull out a checkbook to bail him out. My fingers bypassed my phone and my titanium credit cards, wrapping instead around a single, neatly folded legal document. I pulled the crisp white paper from my clutch. The document carried the official seal of the state of Georgia and the bold, unmistakable signature of a superior court judge. I had not just been acquiring his company and thoroughly investigating his fraud over the past month. My elite wealth management team and private legal counsel had been working around the clock, utilizing every ounce of influence and capital at my disposal to push this specific paperwork through an expedited, highly classified private arbitration process. Desmond stared at the document, his frantic breathing slowing for a fraction of a second as confusion temporarily overrode his panic. "What is that?" he whimpered, his eyes darting from the paper to my impassive face. "These are our finalized divorce papers, Desmond," I announced, keeping my voice perfectly level so that the surrounding crowd could easily hear. "The definitive conclusion of our toxic union. The judge signed the final decree at exactly 4 in the afternoon. You are no longer my husband. I am no longer legally tied to you, your corrupt family, or your bankrupt legacy. We are completely permanently finished." Desmond let out a choked, devastated gasp. The last desperate lifeline he had been clinging to was violently severed. He was entirely alone. I slowly folded the heavy legal document into a tight, precise square. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. Desmond trembled violently as I reached out. With deliberate, meticulous care, I slipped the folded divorce papers directly into the breast pocket of his ruined, blood-stained Tom Ford tuxedo jacket. I patted the fabric once, flattening it against his wildly beating heart. I leaned in closer, my lips hovering mere inches from his ear. Though my voice was a soft, dangerous whisper, the proximity to the stage microphone, coupled with the absolute deathly silence of the 470 captivated guests, ensured that my final words echoed with crystal clarity across the entire St. Regis ballroom. "You asked this quiet room who wanted a useless wife for $10, whispered my voice dripping with lethal, unfiltered satisfaction. "But the price for my actual freedom was a 15-year federal prison sentence for you." His breath hitched, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as the absolute finality of his doom washed over him. "Enjoy your new home, Desmond," I concluded coldly. I straightened my posture, stepping back from the shattered remnants of the man who had tried to destroy me. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed completely. The federal agents had to support his entire heavy dead weight as he wept uncontrollably, a truly broken, pathetic mess being dragged across the marble floor. I did not watch him leave. I turned my back on Desmond, on his sobbing, indicted family, and on the stunned, silent elite of Atlanta. Sterling fell perfectly into step beside me as I walked out of the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air as an independent billionaire powerhouse ready to conquer the world. This moment belonged entirely to me, a testament to the quiet strength I had nurtured in the shadows while they paraded in their false light. The city of Atlanta was now no longer a golden cage built by a legacy family. It was a vast open chessboard, and I held all the winning pieces. I thought back to the orphaned girl who had walked into their pristine mansion years ago, desperately seeking a place to belong. She was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of their betrayal. As my private driver opened the door to my waiting vehicle, I glanced one last time at the glowing facade of the St. Regis Hotel. The soft jazz that had played earlier was completely replaced by the wail of police sirens, a fitting soundtrack for the ultimate demise of the Buckhead elite. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, the door clicking shut and sealing away the chaos of the night. Sterling sat across from me, handing me a crystal glass of aged bourbon. We did not speak. Words were entirely unnecessary. The Vanguard Fund had executed its most ruthless acquisition to date, and my personal ledger was finally perfectly balanced. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. The game was officially over. I had won, and they had lost absolutely everything completely. My brilliant new life awaited. The crisp night air of Atlanta felt different as I watched the grand finale of my carefully orchestrated plan unfold. Federal agents marched Desmond, Trey, and Corinne out of the St. Regis ballroom in a single humiliating line. The heavy steel handcuffs gleamed under the harsh bright lights of the hotel lobby. A swarm of local and national press had already gathered outside the main entrance. News anchors shouted over each other, their camera flashes illuminating the absolute terror and disgrace painted across my former family's faces. Desmond kept his head down, desperately trying to hide his bruised, bleeding lip from the relentless cameras. Corinne stumbled in her ruined designer gown, her face streaked with mascara and freezing water, completely stripped of her pristine, church-going matriarch persona. Outside the glass doors, the chaos continued. Jada, the woman who had paraded around as Sasha, the billionaire tech heiress, was violently pressed against the hood of a police cruiser. Agents were reading her rights for massive identity theft and severe credit fraud. Her rented emerald gown was torn, and she screamed frantically that she had been manipulated, but the officers ignored her pathetic pleas. I stood near the exit, perfectly composed. I smoothed the front of my black silk dress, feeling the absolute weight of my victory. I turned to Sterling, offering a small, genuine smile. I took his offered arm, and together we walked directly through the parted crowd of awestruck elites. The wealthy donors and powerful politicians stepped aside immediately, lowering their eyes in profound respect and absolute fear. I stepped out into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night air, leaving the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters behind. My private driver opened the rear door of my waiting Maybach. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, the heavy door clicking shut and sealing away the noise of my past forever. 6 months passed, and the dust of the Sterling family's catastrophic downfall fully settled into a new reality. The corporate world moves on quickly, but the justice system moves with a deliberate, crushing weight. I watched the security footage from a federal penitentiary facility on my tablet, observing the mundane, brutal routine of the men who had once tried to destroy me. Desmond and Trey were no longer the arrogant, tailored princes of Buckhead real estate. They wore oversized, faded orange jumpsuits. They stood side by side in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, pushing heavy, dirty mops across a stained linoleum floor. Desmond looked hollow, his golden boy charm replaced by the vacant, exhausted stare of a man who realized he would spend the next 15 years locked in a cage. Trey scrubbed the floor with a pathetic, defeated slowness, his Ivy League superiority completely eradicated by the harsh reality of federal prison life. The women of the family faced an equally spectacular, humiliating descent. Corinne avoided prison time due to a plea deal, where she surrendered absolutely everything she owned, but her high society status was gone forever. I received a photograph from one of my investigators showing her current reality. The great untouchable matriarch was now wearing a stained polyester uniform, working a grueling minimum-wage shift at a rundown 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. She was wiping down a greasy counter, her face lined with profound exhaustion and the bitter knowledge that her church friends now pretended she did not exist. Camille, the sister-in-law, who had built her entire identity on luxury and looking down at others, was faring no better. Stripped of her fraudulent boutique and her stolen charity funds, she was currently living in a cramped, dark, roach-infested studio apartment in a dangerous neighborhood. Her designer bags had been seized by federal authorities to pay back the embezzled funds. She spent her days hiding from the creditors and the intense public shame that followed the family's highly publicized ruin. I stood in the expansive penthouse suite of my newly constructed Vanguard skyscraper, located right in the very heart of Buckhead. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the vast Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out before me, glowing with millions of lights, and I knew that I now virtually owned the most lucrative pieces of the ground it was built upon. The hostile takeover had been a flawless, absolute success, transforming their 80-year-old failing empire into a highly profitable division of my holding company. The heavy mahogany door of my office opened quietly. Sterling walked in, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. He approached my desk and handed me a sleek black leather folder. He did not say a word, simply offering a nod of profound respect. I opened the folder to find the finalized, legally binding deed to the original Sterling family estate. The massive, sprawling mansion, where I had endured 6 years of constant mockery, emotional abuse, and cruel isolation, was finally mine. I picked up my gold fountain pen and signed the demolition orders attached to the back of the deed. By next week, the bulldozers would arrive to tear down the physical symbol of their arrogant pride. In its place, my Vanguard Foundation was fully funding the construction of a state-of-the-art comprehensive shelter and educational facility for foster youth. The very system they had mocked me for coming from would now be supported by the ashes of their destroyed legacy. I walked back over to the massive glass window looking down at the bustling city streets far below my penthouse. The reflection of my face in the glass showed a woman completely transformed, forged in the fires of their underestimation and betrayal. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They thought because I came from nothing, I was worth absolutely nothing in their elite world. But the most dangerous woman in the room is never the one screaming desperately for attention or flaunting rented diamonds. It is the one quietly, methodically buying the very building you are currently standing in. The screen fades to black.